pleasure to be with you all. I remember last year, for the first such interaction, I had a wonderful experience. I'm at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, but I'm not a librarian. But I must tell you the library is very rich in archival material, and it's probably the best place to be in when you have to look at history of things. And we constantly grapple with history as much as we try to live with the geography around us. And many of these non-traditional security issues are important in that context to understand where we are located and how to deal with some of the challenges which are quite unexpected these days. So let me begin by using the context to understand what non-traditional security means. It is always very difficult really to segregate security into traditional or non-traditional. You know, academics do that. They don't do anything else but categorize things. But in terms of policy implications, it's always very difficult really. We have to see security as a continuum. You know, there is a certain continuity of security. And I'm not one which tries to do a binary analysis of security. You know, hard security, soft security. I think there is a larger security construct which we have to understand. And many issues these days are becoming securitized or becoming an important security issue. So we need to be alert to the issues around us. And one of the things that is happening in this current world in which we live is that we find ourselves far more interconnected with each other. And the more interconnected we are, we experience greater amount of risks and vulnerabilities. I think that's something quite clear. I think this is the first context we have to understand the 21st century world. We are very interconnected, we are very interdependent. Never before in the history of the world have we been so interactive with each other. We meet, we talk. The social media has got us together on various platforms. Risks we try to assess more and more these days. And the distances in some sense have shrunk. I'm not saying that geography has become irrelevant, but technology has shrunk distances, you know. And there's nothing called remote these days. You know, there's no remote place anymore. Something that might happen in the Arctic region has an impact on the Himalayan glaciers and the Himalayan rainfall pattern. So I think geography has shrunk, geography has become claustrophobic in that sense, if I were to use Robert Kaplan's expression, that we are living in a very claustrophobic world. We're interacting that much more. And as we interact, frictions are created. It's not an easy interaction. Doubts, threats, risks all emerge when we interact. And the classic case is India and China. There's a great degree of openness now and interaction with India and China. And both the countries are simultaneously cooperating, competing, and contesting. You know, so these kind of frames are turning this whole idea of the world into a challenging space now, where we'll have to do a greater amount of introspection on what our risks are all about. We are, in some sense, a risk society, you know, to use the German philosopher's expression, Ulrich Beck's expression, that we are a risk society. We are living constantly with risks and vulnerability. If you see many of our policy planning, it is based on threat assessments. Short-term, mid-term, long-term, we're constantly engaging with the nature of threat and the nature of risks. And I think we need to make a difference between risks, threats, and catastrophes, I think. Risk, not all risks are catastrophes, really. So sometimes we try to scale the risks by saying it is a threat or that it is a catastrophe. And we need to be careful to analyze what are risks, what are threats, and what are catastrophe. Sometimes we tend to raise the alarm, on a certain issue so that we get the kind of policy attention around it. Sometimes material resources are required to deal with such threats. So often we see in the policy circle, some issues are raised dramatically to a position where it creates a lot of alarm-based analysis, and we need to avoid that kind of thing. For example, often we hear that India is going to stop the flow of waters to Pakistan. These are certain alarm-based, emergency-based analysis that happens. The reality is completely different. India has no intention of stopping the waters to Pakistan. How can you really stop water? It's not a tap where you can switch on and switch off, really. So I think in the field of security studies, in the field of threat analysis, we need to be cautious and careful into pointing which risks have an ability to become a threat, right? And not all risks can become threats. And states are capable enough in handling many of these risks, I think. So there's a note of caution when we say, non-traditional security, traditional security issues. In the 21st century, I think security has been redefined. That is for sure. We don't live in the age of the Cold War anymore. In the Cold War, states were known for building their military hardwares. In the 21st century world, when we are coping and dealing with various sets of risks, the best thing that the state could do is build trust. Not build hardwares, but build trust, build cooperation. There's a greater degree of jointmanship in the relationship between states. There's a more emphasis on strategic partnership. And these are new mechanisms of dealing with threat issues in the 21st century. So there is a dramatic shift from the understanding of security and what it meant in the Cold War days to what security means today in a world in which we are far more interconnected, interdependent, and far more mingling with each other. So I think that distinction is quite important. Does it really make sense in the policy domain, or as diplomats, or as security analysts, to really think in terms of separating the traditional from the non-traditional? I think what we are seeing is many of the non-traditional issues which we have categorized becoming actually hard traditional issues. For example, energy issues, for example, water security issues. They're becoming more in the domain of the territory of the states. Protecting one's own territory is protecting the water resources of a country. So I think it's important to understand whether it is a useful way in segregating issues into such categories. Now, hard security analysts will often say that there's a certain degree of intellectual coherence that is required in understanding hard security and understanding other security, and it's not very purposeful if you mix everything together. Security should have a certain limited understanding, defined more in terms of territory, defined in more in terms of sovereignty, state-centric approach to security, and security therefore should be left that way. If you start bringing many issues into the security format, you break that intellectual coherence of security. It becomes rather vague and unmanageable. So everything becomes a security issue. Everything becomes securitized. And in the 21st century, we've seen many of these prefix added to important issues: food security, energy security, water security, health security, cyber security, etc., etc., etc. So, this huge range actually disturbs a certain traditional mindset in which we engaged with security. And that engagement was limited, that engagement was, military defined, and it was easy to deal with. The Cold War period was a much easier way of dealing with threats and risk than the world in which we live in today. The security has become decentered. All the peripheral issues of security that we kept aside in the Cold War days have now become quite mainstream. Simply because I think the world has become far more globalized, the world has become far more interactive, the world is a much more mobilized world. We're moving from one end to another. And therefore I think the issue of security and the issues of risks and threats have definitely gone through a dramatic change in the 21st century, and we need to understand that. In a world in which we live now, when I was talking about interconnectivity, 52% of the world population are now connected through mobiles and through internet, and that's quite a substantial amount. In India, it is predicted by 2030, 80% of India's population, which will be about 1.5 billion, will be connected through internet. So this connectivity is quite enormous in the way we look at threats and risk. India will be 1.5 billion by 2030. The world's population around 1917 was 1.5 billion. So there's almost a world now in India itself, which is having an enormous impact on the way we look at security in South Asia. And this is something that I thought I would highlight. The significance of geography, I think, is also defining the way we look at non-traditional security issues. And we can't negate geography from our conception of security. You all come from various parts of the world in which you're defined by the geography in which you live and in which you interact. And India, in its interaction in South Asia, cannot forget the geography in which it is. And probably I can show you a quick before I come to these datas. I mean, this is really the geography of South Asia. And I think we interact with our geography very well. Not only India, but its neighboring country. And this is a conception of a new geography that we're talking about in South Asia that says that South Asia is actually the third pole. So we know the two poles that exist: the south, the Antarctic, and the north pole, the Arctic. The largest amount of glaciers, snow, ice, and the permafrost are on the mountains of the Himalayas and the plateau and the Tibetan plateau. So there is a reimagination of geography now in which we put the region as the third pole. And India is actually a tripolar nation. Why? Because of our strong engagement in the Antarctic, our strong presence in the Arctic, and therefore our more regional interaction within the Himalayan country. So we are a tripolar nation in that sense. And this redefining the geography in which we live is quite important to understand the various other threats that emanate from this. So we look at South Asia as often, and you would have read about South Asia, that we've had a bitter history, we've had a history of invasion, that we had a very bloody partition with Pakistan, and then the further partition with Bangladesh. It's all about a history that is hurtful, the history that is painful, etc. But if you look at South Asia purely in terms of the physical interaction that we have with many of the states, I think geography defines it. We should describe South Asia more as the Himalayan watershed, because there's a huge dependence on the Himalayan ecosystems in terms of the rivers that flow, in terms of the Himalayas managing and balancing the climate and the weather patterns in South Asia itself. Sometimes we should look at South Asia as a riverine neighborhood, simply because all the countries in South Asia are connected through rivers. And rivers can become a catalyst of cooperation, not a catalyst for conflict, really. So, and South Asia has experienced this in the last 70 years. There's been water sharing agreements with India and Pakistan, with India and Bangladesh, which is unlike any other region in the world. Right? So this imagine this picture of South Asia being a flashpoint, this picture of South Asia being a region which is volatile and can be easily disrupted by the affairs between India and Pakistan really does not hold solid on ground, because we've had far greater and stronger treaties on the water. We often say that the 21st century is a century of water wars, and probably South Asia would be the first flashpoint to such a war. But on the ground, there is no such feeling. There are treaties which coexist. There are treaties which have lasted more than 60 years. The Indus water treaties this year will celebrate 60 years between two difficult countries. Yet when it comes to coexisting on water resources, using the benefits of water in South Asia, the countries have dramatically come forward to sign treaties and memorandum of understanding. And that is the case between not only India and Pakistan, but between India and Nepal, between India and Bhutan, between India and Bangladesh. So I think when we look at South Asia as a riverine neighborhood, being connected through rivers, I think it's a new way of engaging in South Asia. And this current government's one of the first foreign policy principles is the neighborhood first, then comes everything else. So if you have a neighborhood that is stable, if you have a neighborhood that coexists, if you have a neighborhood that shares the benefit, I think then you will and think about a larger engagement with the rest of the globe. So everything begins first in the neighborhood, and therefore it's a priority for India to engage with its neighboring country and bring in certain policies that are worthwhile, long term, and engaging in terms of the benefits that are derived from it. So I think geography plays an important role. And geography will constantly play an important role because the impact of climate change on South Asia is enormous. South Asia probably is one of the regions in the world which is the most vulnerable to climate change impact. And you can see from this picture, not only in terms of the melting of the glaciers in the mountains, which will be very disruptive in terms of the weather patterns, in terms of the flow of the rivers, but I think also the long coastline that South Asia has, which includes Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, also the island of Maldives and Sri Lanka. With the sea level rise, you can well understand that how vulnerable South Asia is. India has a 7,500 kilometer coastline, which is quite enormous, really. And while we look at the mountains in terms of a defensive natural barrier to enemy invasion, we also need to see the coastlines that we've had, which is a very important part of the larger climate systems prevailing. So we can be damaged at both ends, from the mountains and from the coastal areas. And that makes South Asia very vulnerable to climate change impact. In the mountains, the average annual temperature has increased far more than what we see on the plains. And Nepal, the Tibet part is quite important here to understand the changes that are happening here. Science has often debated that, that climate has always changed, really. But I think we're getting increasingly closer to the understanding that, climate is changing, and the reason for that change is us. So there is a world in which we live called the Anthropocene world. We have to understand our own engagement in changing the patterns of climate. We are the principal contributor to the disruption that has happened in the climate sphere. And this is an acknowledgement that we have to carry. It's a very hard acknowledgement because human beings don't really want to be seen as being the enemy to such destruction. If you look at the long history of how science and society has evolved, you would see that man always wanted to conquer, nature, and that was the forte. He had the mind, he had the inquiry, he had the intelligence to do it. But now to turn around and say that you are the principal culprit is something that humankind hasn't really accepted. But that is what science is telling us. And therefore, science becomes a very important driver to analyze non-traditional security threats. And we cannot ignore or divorce science from our policy analysis. Science is telling many things, and we have to be patient in understanding what those scientific data and assessments are. And we have to understand now very clearly that climate is changing, and there are plenty of indicators that suggest that. But while it is changing, what should be the action around it is something that we haven't really come to decide upon. There has been a developed countries' perspective on how to deal with climate change and the actions around climate change. There's been a developing countries' perspective on how to deal with climate change, and never the two have met. We are trying to constantly reach a convergence of climate actions, but there is obviously a different perspective and a different way the Western world or the developed countries look at it, and where the developing countries look at it. Indira Gandhi, one of our prime ministers, had way back in 1972 in Stockholm gone and said a very important statement. He'd raised the question by saying that poverty can be the greatest polluter. And I think that line has defined the developmental principles of many of the developing countries. That if we do not develop, then we are heading towards greater amount of poverty, and greater amount of poverty would mean greater pollution. So I think that linkage is quite important in our developmental perspective. We need development, and by needing the development, we also probably need a space to pollute, right? And there is this atmospheric space which the developed countries have captured, but the developing country needs that space to develop, because if you don't develop, you'll further emit. And this principle is a defining principle of how the world has been split over dealing with climate change. And I think post-Paris 2015, there's been a general understanding now that the principles of polluters principle is quite important now. And I think India, and there's a general understanding now that while developing countries need to develop, but our development would be not the way the Western world developed. So I think there's a greater understanding now that India, for example, would like to develop, but would like to develop in a proper manner of not just polluting, but in a cost benefit analysis of things. So we have stressed more on renewable energies. We've set ambitious target, lessen our dependence on fossil fuel, emphasize more on natural gas, use more the natural surrounding like the sun, the wind, etc. to bring in this new set of energy that is required. And therefore we are recasting our energy security in a very different light. We have tremendous amount of coal resources which we need to use, but we also need to bring in more technology into this coal extraction and the business of coal in power generation. And I think this is where more interaction with the Western world in terms of technology transfer, in terms of climate finance, would be an important part of the way we are going to develop. So everyone is on the same sort of boat, so to speak. No one can really take an isolated position anymore. And this is the thing about non-traditional security issues, that no one is really independent and no one can be shielded from the kind of threat and risks that will emerge from these issues. And therefore one is far more integrated in understanding these. There's a classic Rousseau parable which says that you have to hunt a stag together. The hunters will have to be together to hunt a stag. If one of the hunters leaves, the stag will go away. I think this world quite clearly tells us that we have to be together in dealing with climate change issues. No one has that kind of strength or the resource or the material wherewithal to deal with climate change without not cooperating with each other, whether it's in terms of finance, whether it's in terms of technology transfer, etc., etc. So I think climate change is determining many of the non-traditional issues. It has direct link to food, it has direct link to energy, and it has direct link to water. And I think this food, energy, and water is the nexus that we have to explore. It is quite interconnected. It's what was described as a perfect storm, which we have to witness, all of us. Because if you do not handle your water resources carefully, that will definitely have an impact on the food resources. And energy is an important component of all this. Energy in the agricultural sector, energy when it comes to producing hydroelectricity from water. So this nexus, food, energy, and water, I think is quite critical in dealing with many of the non-traditional security issues. This is a sort of an outline map of what Asia is. Asia is a continent of great rivers, mighty rivers, and you can see many of these rivers emanating from one country and flowing down to another. And simply, regional stability in this part of the world will come from water stability. If you don't have requisite water, uh, which deals with both the political, social, and economic pressures, then obviously you'll find this area becoming an arc of instability. And therefore, it's very critical to emphasize on how states manage their water resources domestically, but also how states manage their interstate relationship on rivers between each other also. And here you can see that there's a great deal of interaction on the rivers between various states. China has a huge amount of river interaction with its riparian countries, especially the southeast countries on the Mekong. India, as a powerful riparian, has its interaction with its neighboring country on the Brahmaputra, Ganga, Indus, and of course the Southeast Asian countries also. You can see many of the many of the river basin playing a very strong interactive role, which will determine the political stability, the economic returns, etc., in near time. But coming closer to South Asia, this is how the rivers look like in the northern part of South Asia, which all flows from the Himalayas. It's a very peaceful way of looking at rivers. Seems to be gently flowing, reaching its destination without any disruption. But when you put the political boundaries, it sort of creates a complexity that we have to deal with. Boundaries do create complexities. Boundaries are about territory, boundaries are about sovereignty, etc. But the rivers are flowing, as you can see. And it's always flowed through history, through time. And it has determined the regional politics in South Asia, right from the time of partition in 1947, till even now, when we talk about the neighborhood first, when we talk about sub-regional engagement, rivers are playing a critical role in South Asia's politics. And this is something that we have to understand far more than what we understood earlier. We have... do I have time? 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Okay. Right. So, yeah. So if you look at the western side of our rivers, more towards Pakistan, and probably the Indus is the much noted river basin in the world, because we've often looked at the Indus as, a basin which might lead to a possibility of war between India and Pakistan. But the ground assessments are very clear. We have a treaty with Pakistan, a treaty which India has not abrogated, despite the wars with Pakistan. So this is a very important understanding of river treaties, that despite wars, despite difficult political and diplomatic relationship with the country, water treaties survive. Why? And there are reasons for that, because water has a certain economic return, water has a certain social value, and that has always remained strong, and it hasn't been disrupted with the difficult relationship that it had with India and Pakistan. Though there's been debate often, and you probably would have sensed in the last couple of years that India has strongly considered to pull out of the treaty. But there are certain norms and principles of the treaty that we still continue to abide with. And I think this treaty will continue to survive. unless both the countries come together and say, well, the treaty has outlived its purpose and that we have to think about a new treaty given new knowledge on the water sharing between India and Pakistan. On the eastern side of India, you can see that there are enormous flow of rivers from one country to another. And I think this part of South Asia is interlocked with each other. You know, interlocked with, as they say in Nepal, interlocked with each other's intestine. You know, such is our interlocking phenomena in South Asia that we can't really think in terms of disrupting the kind of engagement that we are having. And here again, rivers are playing a critical role in defining South Asian politics, in defining the sub-regional politics of South Asia. And rivers here are seen from various dimensions. They are looked at in terms of course, hydroelectricity generation, and therefore you'll have to think in terms of creating plenty of dams in the Nepal part of the country. This is the plain, and then this is the delta of South Asia. So you can see Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, along with Bhutan, quite interconnected through the rivers. India has recently had the national legislation on national waterways. You know, so inland navigation is going to play an important role. And if you look at the geography, quite clearly you will see that the rivers, you know, can carry not only water and silt, but it can carry a huge amount of transport from one end to another. And landlocked countries like Nepal and Bhutan, who have always aspired to reach the seas, will find through the rivers an important transport mechanism. And I think the world over, we have seen, whether it's the huge inland water system in the United States or a very well integrated inland waterways in Europe, we have seen that the inland waterways has changed the dynamics of region. And we have to learn from these regions and put those experiences into action in South Asia. And I think this new thrust and this new emphasis on inland waterways is changing the contours of South Asian politics in a very new way. And that is something that has brought a new dimension to sub-regional interaction in South Asia. We also have an important player, China, which we cannot forget when it comes to water relationship. And we have this very critical river called the Brahmaputra that flows from the Tibet, covers a vast territory of China before it comes to India. And if you look at the riparian representation, China obviously sits at the top as the upper riparian, and India becomes the middle riparian, and the countries like Bangladesh and on this side Pakistan becomes the lower riparian. So I think this riparian equations are quite interesting in South Asia. While India, as an upper riparian, has settled its issues with its lower riparian, China, as an upper riparian, has not. And this is something that we understand, we are concerned, and we look forward to a greater amount of engagement with China. Now, China is very much part of South Asia. You know, politically, you might keep China away as an observer to the South Asian politics in some of the regional configurations that we've had, like SARC, etc. But hydrologically, you can't keep China away, you know, because simply it is linked through the rivers to South Asia. And that is a new understanding that we have when we reinterpret South Asian politics, that there has to be an engagement with China on, you know, issues of river sharing and river water sharing in particular. Now, India has a memorandum of understanding with China on the Brahmaputra, which is a critical river in the northeast part of India. This is probably one of the mightiest rivers in the world in terms of volume. Its importance in terms of hydroelectricity is critical for India as it's trying to uh, build the Northeast as an important economic base. And now, in terms of navigation, the Brahmaputra is now almost a lifeline of the region. And for India to pay attention on the Brahmaputra is important because by paying attention to the Brahmaputra, India will also engage Bangladesh and Bhutan with it. And therefore, there is a larger sub-regional construction to the Brahmaputra. Brahmaputra is just not about India and China, but there's a larger dimension to it. And I think India is quite alert to this aspect. So we have a memorandum of understanding with China on the Brahmaputra, which is all about sharing hydrological data, more transparency in information. That is quite important. When we analyze these new security threats, these new non-traditional security threats, one element would be transparency of information. That's going to be a critical driver. And countries will like to hold certain information, because in terms of strategy and tactics, it helps. But I think if you have to deal with it in a transnational way, and these issues are transnational in nature, it's not reserved to one particular territory or to one particular country. So if you have to deal with this issue in a transnational, regional context, countries have to learn to share more information. There has to be a greater degree of transparency in understanding these issues in terms of rivers, in terms of climate change, etc. So withholding information can be a dangerous thing. And we are learning in this cooperation with China that the initial reluctance to engage in sharing information is now becoming a little more openness. And this is something which is quite good because China doesn't really have water sharing agreements with its riparian countries. Not with India, not with any of its 17 riparian states. That also includes the countries on the Mekong. So at best with China, you can engage bilaterally and have these kind of relationship based on information sharing, which is important. And I don't think India should expect anything beyond this in terms of its relationship with China on the Brahmaputra. India, and I strongly feel that for India, Brahmaputra is important in its relationship with Bangladesh and in its rather new emphasis on sub-region. Where, China is a settled matter because we can't go anything beyond that. I think there's more engagement that India needs to do on the Brahmaputra with Bangladesh. And matters of connectivities, rivers linking both ends will be quite important. These rivers will become an enormous connector to the transport of goods from this part to this part. And as this part develops, this will bolster India's Act East policy or, towards the Southeast Asia will become that much more reinvigorated. So you can see that rivers are just not local or regional anymore. If you strengthen and bolster the returns from the river, the economic returns from the river, you can connect this eastern part of India to the larger Act East approach that India has. Rivers are becoming important symbols also of bringing two regions together. We have something called the Mekong-Ganga Cooperation, or the Ganga-Mekong Cooperation. Two rivers which symbolizes two regions coming together in terms of economic engagement, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of technological understanding. So rivers bring in regions together. We also have a new symbol of rivers called the Ganga Volga with the Russians. It's creating that space of engagement because rivers are not anymore seen as rivers of disruption. Rivers are seen today as rivers of engagement, and you use that as a symbol to bring regions together. And that is something quite refreshing in India's regional foreign policy these days. Something that we have to appreciate and understand as well. So,
That is okay.